We begin an interesting phase of our adventure. Although the book is written in the third person, it is written from Bilbo's perspective. The only events in the book are those that Bilbo personally witnessed, except for a few pieces that were specifically told to him afterwards. Therefore, only in the briefest and most general way was 80% of the actual battle included in Bilbo's journal. Or to put it another way, only 20% of this movie could actually be known to us. The other 80% is 100% pure Peter Jackson. Days passed. The dwarves were busy cataloging their treasures, while Thorin's greed for the Arkenstone grew. The ravens brought news from the east. Thorin's cousin Dain was hurrying to Erebor with an army of 500 dwarves. But Roic cautioned Thorin that even that number would fare badly against the host of men and elves that were gathering. And winter wasn't far away. The dwarves would be even worse off without the goodwill of their neighbors. Thorin would have none of it. Bilbo, however, was hatching a plan. Once it was dark, he climbed up to the top of the watching post on the top of the wall. Bombur was on duty. They chatted, Bombur complaining about the cold. Bilbo said he wasn't tired and would be willing to cover if Bombur wanted to sneak inside and have a nap. Bombur, of course, quickly and gratefully accepted the offer. Bilbo waited a few minutes, then climbed down the mountain and headed for the besiegers' encampment. The rest of the sequence is one of Jackson's standard adaptation methods. Take random pages from throughout the book, put them in a Cuisinart, turn it on high for 10 seconds, pour out half of the contents, and scotch tape them together. Voila! The script. Okay. Gandalf was not there. The Elven King had no idea of Bilbo's activities back at his palace. Bilbo did make a vague reference to it after the battle. Yes, Bilbo offered the Arkenstone as a bargaining tool, and did explain that he took it as his 1/14th share of the loot. But that's about it. Bilbo felt a certain loyalty to the dwarves, even if he didn't agree with them. So he declined Elven King's invitation to stay. As he was leaving, an old man in a dark cloak came up to him, slapped him on the back, and said, "Well done, Mr. Baggins. There's always more about you than anyone expects." Now Gandalf shows up.
You there! Find this hobbit a bed.
And there was, thankfully, no Alfred. Bilbo made his way back to the mountain and awoke Bombur, as he had promised, before curling up in a corner and falling fast asleep, happily dreaming of bacon and eggs. As often happens, the sun came up the next morning. A messenger from the besiegers approached the mountain and hailed Thorin. He asked for another parley, saying that new tidings had come to hand. Thorin thought this was because they spotted Dain's company approaching. So he said he'd accept a small number of unarmed men and elves. This party approached, headed by Bard, Elven King, and, quote, an old man wrapped in cloak and hood, unquote, carrying a chest, conspicuous in the film by his absence. After some bickering, Bard finally asks Thorin if there isn't something, anything, that would convince Thorin to honor his deals. Receiving the answer, quote, "Nothing that you could offer," unquote, Bard asks, "What of the Arkenstone?" At which moment the old man stepped forward and opened the chest. Thorin was stricken.
We have this. The king may have it. With our goodwill. But first, he must honor his word.
The ensuing argument was much as you'd expect. That's mine, give it back. We'll give it back when you give us what's ours, etc., etc. And finally, where did you get it? At that, a tiny voice squeaked, "I gave it to them."
It's no trick.
Hearing Bilbo admit it
The stone
sent
is real.
Thorin ballistic.
I gave it to them.
There was a lot more cursing and threatening and cursing.
I'll do it myself. Curse you! No! Curse be the wizard that forced you!
Gandalf finally shows himself
Please.
and does the "give me back my burglar" bit, which is probably the last piece of the book you'll find in the film, unless it's been heavily modified, until the very end.
You're not making a very splendid figure as king under the mountain, are you? Thorin, son of Thren.
However, there are a few things to mention here. Yes, Dane shows up. It looks like there are far more CGI dwarves than the 500 mentioned in the book. Dane does not make a speech. And there's only a brief skirmish before Gandalf finally does some serious wizarding and stop them all. The orcs / goblins attack. We'll not worry here about the difference or similarity between the two.
Werewolves.
Weirworms? Weirworms? Both Tolkien and Frank Herbert are rolling over in their graves over that one. I'm with Billy Connolly.
Oh, come on!
Azog was killed 142 years earlier by Dane, who seems to have forgotten all about it. In The Hobbit, Peter Jackson creates an entirely different backstory for the dwarves than Tolkien stated in Appendix A of The Return of the King. As we should be used to by now, when Tolkien writes about a battle, it's rarely more than about 4 pages and contains only a few major events. John Smith was particularly brave. The Great Leslie beat Professor Fate, and the good guys won. Peter Jackson, however, suffers from a seriously unhealthy obsession with violence, and will present an hour or more of film battle time, no matter what nonsense he needs to make up. Tolkien was decidedly anti-war, and would never have approved of Jackson's mutilation of his stories. Now here's something nice to take your minds off all the carnage for a moment. The 2 girls who played Bard's daughters really are sisters, which you could probably tell by looking at them. Mary and Peggy Nesbit, daughters of James Nesbit. Ophir. For the next hour, Peter Jackson is in full-bore lunatic mode. There may be a few 5 or 10 second clips in all this that approach sanity. I'll try to pull him out of the morass if I can. But otherwise, we'll skim through or skip over all the nonsense. Let's catch our breath for a moment while Thorin recovers from his bout of dragon sickness stroke gold fever. Ready? Let's go. And guess what? A scene from the book. Sort of. While all this mayhem was going on, everyone had forgotten about Thorin and company. Suddenly, a trumpet call rang out from the gate. No giant golden bell, but a system of levers collapsed a section of the wall and outpoured the dwarves. If 13 can be said to pour. Thorin rallied the troops, dwarves, men, and even elves. They tore into the ranks of goblins and drove off the wargs. Now, I'll still refer to the creatures as goblins, since that's what they're called in this book, even though they are represented in the movie as orcs. However, Bolg, remember, Azog was long since dead, and his bodyguards stood strong. They surrounded the dwarves, men, and elves and closed in. Bilbo was watching all this from the mountainside, thinking depressing thoughts. He caught sight of a gleam in the gloomy skies, and his heart was lifted. The eagles were coming. Stone hurtling down the mountain struck Bilbo, and in typical Tolkienian chapter-closing line, he fell with a crash and knew no more. Unquote. End of chapter 17. Only 2 to go. So, 40 or 50 minutes of movie battle. None of it on ice. None of it defying gravity. Just a battle, for crying out loud. Occurred while Bilbo was unconscious, therefore unable to report on it. As Bilbo came to, all was quiet. He looked around No living goblins could be seen. Elves were moving about, and dwarves were clearing rubble from around the front gate. Gandalf had sent men out looking for Bilbo. He was aware of one of them climbing toward him. He called out. The man was startled to hear the rocks talking. Bilbo forgot he had the ring on. The man carried the hobbit down the dale and presented him to the wizard. Gandalf's delight quickly turned serious. He hustled Bilbo off to the nearby tent, to the dying Thorin, who had about 2 minutes left. He gave his farewell and repentance speech, then expired.
Bilbo, I wish to part from you in friendship. I will take back my word and my deed to the king. You did what only a true friend would do. Forgive me. I was too blind to see it. I am so sorry that I have led you into such peril. Farewell, Master Burglar. Go back to your books and your armchair. If more people valued all above gold, this world would be a merry place.
Bilbo wrapped himself in a blanket, curled up in a corner, and cried. In the days that followed, Bilbo learned all that happened while he was unconscious. Tolkien graciously fills the reader in as well. The eagles had long suspected the goblins were planning something, so they gathered great numbers of their own kind as well. When they smelled, it's Tolkien's word, battle brewing, they took off for the mountain. And they did a dandy job of clearing the sides of the mountain. But even then, the goblins still had the upper hand. At last, Beorn appeared. Professor Tolkien tells us, quote, "No one knew how or from where," unquote. Not hitchhiking with the eagles, he just showed up in his bear shape. And he seemed to have grown to giant size. He tore through the goblins like a tornado through Oklahoma. He pulled down Bolg and crushed him. The remaining goblins fled in all directions. Beorn found Thorin, mortally wounded, and carried him from the field. His young nephews, Fili and Kili, had died defending him. Bilbo asked about the eagles. Gandalf told him some had joined in the hunt for the fugitive goblins, but most had returned to their eyries. Dain rewarded them, yeah, like eagles have any use for gold, and pledged eternal friendship. Thorin was buried deep beneath the mountain. Bard placed the Arkenstone on his breast, and Elven King did likewise with Orcrist. Dain became king under the mountain, and Thorin's surviving companions remained with him. Dain gave 1/14 of the hoard to Bard. He sent much of it back to the Master to rebuild Lake Town. He kept much to rebuild Dale. He gave some emeralds to the Elven King that the elf had fancied, and in so many words, offered Bilbo as much as he wanted. Bilbo, of course, only took 2 small chests, as much as a strong pony could carry. Although I think the film only showed 1, and they lost the pony just before Hobbiton. Oh, and two things I forgot to tell you. Gandalf should use energizers instead of those cheap store brand batteries. And Alfred finally got his just comeuppance. I cheered. The farewell scene is a little different. Now, Tolkien's work is strong on character development. Jackson could care less, as long as there's battles. Literary Bilbo has grown, matured, is more confident.
Farewell, Balin, he said, and farewell, Dwalin, and farewell, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Bifur, Bofa, and Bomba. May your beards never grow thin. And turning towards the mountain, he added, Farewell, Thorin Oakenshield, and Fili and Kili. May your memory never fade. If ever you are passing my way, said Bilbo, don't wait to knock. Tea is at 4, but any of you are welcome at any time.
Cinematic Bilbo remains unsure of himself, a bit awkward. He doesn't quite know what to say.
If any of you are ever passing Bag End, tea is at 4. There's plenty of it. You are welcome anytime. Don't bother knocking.
Bilbo and Gandalf joined the Elven King and his host, with Beorn as a man striding beside. They came to the edge of Mirkwood, where the Wood Elves said goodbye in the best Tolkien-esque flowery language. Bilbo presented the king with a silver and pearl necklace, in appreciation of the king's unknowing hospitality last year. Bilbo, Gandalf, and Beorn continued around the northern and eastern edges of the forest until they reached Beorn's house. They spent a warm and merry Yuletide there. Come spring, Bilbo and Gandalf departed. Bilbo noting his Tookish side was waning, and the Baggin side was getting stronger. He now only wished for his armchair. On May the 1st, they found themselves on the brink of the Valley of Rivendell. The elves were once again singing that stupid tra-la-la-lally song. Bilbo learned where Gandalf had been to all that time. He had attended a meeting of the White Council, where it was finally decided to drive the necromancer out of Mirkwood. One sentence in the book, long after the fact. 17.5 minutes spread over 2 movies. Bilbo dozed off. He awoke to the elves singing another song, but a more sensible one. Then he dozed off again. After a week of R&R, they again hit the road. They left the valley and crossed the ford. They found the spot where the dwarves had buried the troll gold, dug it up, and split it between them. A day came at last, when coming over a rise, Bilbo could see his own hill. He stops and recites the words to one of the many versions of The Road Goes Ever On. Gandalf is impressed. They cross the bridge and pass the mill. Gandalf has somehow mysteriously and inexplicably vanished from the story. Bilbo comes upon the auction, which is portrayed fairly accurately, except there is no mention of Thorin.
Who is this person you pledged your service to? Thorin Oakenshield.
He was my friend.
The legal bother lasted for years. It took a long time to convince everyone that he was not dead and to buy back his possessions. He had also lost his highly Baggins-ish reputation for stability, now often referred to as Mad Baggins. One evening, some 6 years later, as he was working on his memoirs, came a ring at the door. It was Gandalf and Balin. They reminisced, of course, and Bilbo learned all that had happened around the mountain. Now, there's some contradiction here, internally as well as with the Lord of the Rings. But it's the last page, and Tolkien was probably getting rather tired. He says here that Bard rebuilt Dale. The Lord of the Rings appendix says Bard actually became king, and was followed by his son Bane, and his son Brand, who was king at the time of the War of the Ring. However, The Hobbit says Lake Town was refounded, and, well, remember back when the Master didn't get crushed by the dragon, and I said there was more to tell about him? To quote the applicable paragraph, quote, "The old Master had come to a bad end. Bard had given him much of gold for the help of the lake people. But being of the kind that easily catches such diseases, he fell under the dragon sickness, and took most of the gold and fled with it, and died of starvation in the waste, deserted by his companions." Balin adds that the new master is of wiser kind, and very popular. We'll discount the fact that Jackson had Bard move the entire city to Dale after Smaug's demise. So, is there a new lake town with a new master? Did everyone move to Dale? Were there then 2 towns of men in close proximity? It doesn't matter. Regardless, Bilbo never denies finding the ring.
Magic rings should not be used lightly, Bilbo. Don't take me for a fool. I know you found one in the goblin tunnels, and I've kept my eye on you.
Or claims he lost it.
Well, you needn't worry about that ring. It fell out of my pocket during the battle. I lost it.
But it is only now that Gandalf says,
You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck? You're a very fine person, Mr. Baggins. And I'm very fond of you. But you're only quite a little fellow. In a wide world, after all.
and we come to the real, actual end. At least for another 54 years. Time to sit back in your armchair, put your feet up before a roaring fire, and pour a nice cup of tea. Let's relax and ponder a bit about what we've learned here. I, for one, have learned that The Hobbit is a very good single 2-hour movie. Maybe 2 good 1.5 to 1:45 movies. But there simply is not enough source material to warrant a trilogy. Now, how much of this was Jackson? How much was Del Toro? How much was MGM? There are all sorts of stories. I'd say no one is to blame, but no one is blameless. I'll allow that Peter Jackson is a very good director, a good screenwriter, and a good producer. Where he falls down is as an adapter. He seems to think that adapting literature to cinema consists of taking the central idea and pretty much writing a whole new story around it. Now, I've also solidified my opinion that only an idiot would seriously try to compare The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. It's much like comparing filet mignon to a Big Mac. Both delicious, but meant for different audiences. At least the books. Jackson tried to make the movie Hobbit Lord of the Rings light. It just doesn't work. The Hobbit was, and still is, a children's fantasy story. A sort of fairy tale, if you will. It was indeed originally written as a bedtime story. The Lord of the Rings is an adult epic about the eternal struggle between good and evil. I find The Lord of the Rings very rewatchable and rereadable. The Hobbit, not so much. Now, that's more a comment on the sophistication of the concepts presented than on the quality of the product. Both are equally superb and enjoyable on their own terms. They exist in the same universe, but are not in the same realm. In any event, do yourself a favor. Read the books. At first, it may seem that the movies get more confusing, but that's because Peter Jackson butchered the stories to such a great extent. However, the books contain a ton of extra information that the movies just didn't have time for. That will answer a lot of questions you may have, actually making the movies more sensible. As for me, I'm heading back to Hobbiton for Bilbo's birthday party. Care to join me? When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton.